4 days. That's the length of time sitting between two dates in Exodus 12 that almost every reading of this chapter walks straight past. God tells Israel to select their Passover lamb on the 10th day of the month. He doesn't tell them to kill it until the 14th. Roughly 96 hours sit in between those two instructions, and the chapter never once explains what those hours are actually for. It isn't shy about explaining everything else around them. The exact day the animal gets chosen. The exact kind of animal. Exact instructions for what happens to it once the knife comes out, how to cook it, what to eat alongside it, what to do with what's left over, even what to wear while eating it. But the gap itself, why an enslaved household in a foreign empire would need to keep a living, breathing creature inside their one-room home for the better part of a week before anything actually happens to it, gets zero comment. Total silence. And because most of us already know how this story ends, we read straight through that silence without noticing it. We know the beats by heart. Blood on the doorframe. Judgment moving through the country at midnight. A nation walking out into the desert before sunrise. Those 4 quiet days in the middle don't survive the retelling. They don't make it into the children's Bible illustration of a family gathered around a meal. They almost never make it into a sermon, because on the surface, nothing dramatic happens in them at all. Nothing moves the plot forward. Except something does happen in those 4 days. It just doesn't happen to the plot. It happens to the people. Here's a different way to read this chapter, and it's worth trying before we go any further. Read it the way you'd read the instructions printed on the side of a package. Take one of these. Do this to it. Whatever you do, do not do that instead. Because that's genuinely the register Exodus 12 is written in. It isn't flowery. It isn't full of explanation. It's short, clipped, and oddly, specifically particular about details that seem to have absolutely nothing to do with the actual goal. Which is getting an enslaved nation safely out of the country. Roast the meat. Don't boil it. Don't break its bones. Put the blood in exactly one place, and nowhere else. Keep your sandals on while you eat dinner at your own table. Individually, each of those instructions sounds like a strange bit of household trivia. But hold the whole list up to the light at once, turn it slightly, and a shape starts showing through it, because every single one of these rules is doing something specific to the family holding that animal. Not to Pharaoh. Not to Egypt. To the family. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you for a second. 15 centuries later, one by one, in order, those same exact details start resurfacing. In the written record of a public execution outside the walls of Jerusalem. We're going to walk through every one of them, in order, and by the end you'll see exactly why that second appearance isn't a coincidence anyone needs to strain to find. Before any of that, picture where this is actually happening, because the flannel board Sunday school version of this story quietly undersells the size of it. Israel isn't a band of nomads camped loosely somewhere on the outskirts of Egypt. They're settled in Goshen, the fertile eastern edge of the Nile Delta. In the same region Joseph arranged for his family generations earlier. By this point they have houses. Streets. Neighbors they've known for years. Property lines. Furniture worn smooth from use. This is a population that has lived in this land long enough to think of parts of it as home, even while being worked brutally, as forced labor on the building projects of the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. And that empire is not in a forgiving mood. 9 plagues have already come and gone, each one worse than the last. The Nile itself ran red. The livestock across the country died in the fields. Darkness sat so thick over the land for 3 straight days that Egyptian households reportedly didn't leave their homes. Pharaoh has bent under the pressure and hardened his heart again, more than once, in a cycle the text tracks almost like a heartbeat. By now the whole nation, Egyptian and Israelite alike, is exhausted, watching, waiting to see what happens next. And the warning already sitting on the table, delivered and not yet withdrawn, is the heaviest one of the entire sequence. Every firstborn in the land, human and animal, from the throne room down to the prison cell, now stands under a coming sentence. Here's the detail worth pausing on before moving another inch further into the chapter. This coming judgment does not simply skip past the Hebrew households by default, on the basis of ancestry alone. Israel gets instructions too. Whatever protection is coming that night is not automatic. It has to be actually, physically applied by the people who are going to need it. And right before that final blow falls, God does something that, on paper, sounds almost administrative. He resets the calendar. This month, he tells Moses and Aaron, becomes the first month of the year for Israel, starting now. Not next year. Not after the rescue is finished and everyone's had time to catch their breath. Before a single plague-ending event has even taken place, the clock gets zeroed out. Whatever year Israel believed they were living in a moment ago, they are now, officially, standing at year 1. That's the exact moment the specific instructions begin. The animal specified is a Hebrew term that covers more ground than the English word lamb lets on. It can be taken from either the sheep or the goats, one single animal pulled deliberately out of the flock. Not a particular breed. Not the soft, storybook image most of us default to. One animal, singled out, and, this matters more than it sounds like it should, one that actually costs the household something real to give up. A healthy, unblemished male in its first year represents real future value in a subsistence economy, wool for next winter, milk, eventual breeding stock, meat that could have fed the family for much longer than one night. An enslaved population with next to nothing doesn't have spare animals sitting around to burn through casually. The instructions even build in an accommodation for households too small to eat a whole animal on their own, directing them to pair up with the nearest neighboring household and divide the cost based on exactly how much each person present can actually eat. Nobody gets to opt out of the cost by claiming their family is too small. That's the world this instruction lands in. Now, the first concrete date, on the 10th day of this month, each household takes one animal for itself. The 10th. And then, immediately following that instruction, comes the second date that most people's memory of this story quietly skips: keep it until the 14th. Sit with that word, keep, for a second, because the English translation genuinely undersells what's happening underneath it. The underlying Hebrew term carries the weight of an active guard duty. A watch, a charge, something held with attention, not simply stored somewhere and left alone. It belongs to the same family of words used elsewhere in Scripture for standing watch on a city wall, for tending a garden, for keeping a covenant faithfully over time. This animal is not parked in a back room and forgotten about for 96 hours. It is actively, continuously watched. And the size of an ordinary home in this setting matters enormously here. A working household in that world typically lived in one, maybe two rooms, with the entire family sleeping in the same shared space. There was no spare wing of the house to tuck a small animal into and quietly ignore for 4 days. Which means, very concretely, that for 4 straight days that lamb was underfoot. It was in the same room where the family ate their meals. It heard their voices, learned the particular sound of their door opening and closing. Grew used to the rhythm of their footsteps. And if there were children in that house, and in the overwhelming majority of these households there were, it is almost impossible to imagine that animal not being fed by hand, petted, talked to, given something close to a name, well before the 4th day arrived. This isn't a sentimental guess layered onto the text from the outside. Scripture itself hands us exactly this picture, elsewhere, in a completely different story. When the prophet Nathan needs to describe something precious being stolen from a man, in order to confront King David, the story he reaches for is a poor man's one small ewe lamb. An animal, Nathan says, that grew up right alongside the man's own children, ate from his plate, drank from his own cup, slept curled in his arms, and was loved the way a daughter is loved. That story only lands the emotional blow it's meant to land because everyone in the room already understood, without being told, that small livestock genuinely lived inside poor households like this. Not as pets exactly, but as something close to family. 4 days is a long time to share one room with a living creature. By the 14th, whatever that lamb had been on the 10th. It wasn't simply livestock anymore in any way that mattered emotionally. It had habits. A personality the household could have described to a stranger. A side it liked to lie on. And that, more than any other single explanation, is very likely what the 4-day gap is actually for. A substitute you never truly looked at costs you nothing real to lose. Try imagining the instructions had simply run differently. Walk to the market on the morning of the 14th. Buy any healthy animal from a stranger you've never seen before and will never see again. Have it dead within the hour. Blood on the doorframe before sundown. Would Israel still have walked free the next morning? Almost certainly, yes. The mechanics of the rescue don't strictly require 4 days of prior ownership. But the entire night would have registered completely differently in the memory of that household. It would have felt like a procedure completed, the way an errand gets crossed off a list. Not like a cost that was actually, personally felt. The instruction to select the animal 4 days ahead of time closes off that entire possibility in advance. You simply cannot hold a living creature in your home for 4 days, watch it, feed it, hear it, and then file its death away under paperwork. There's a second, far more practical thing happening across those same 4 days, and it's easy to miss if you're only thinking about emotional attachment. 4 days of constant, close proximity is also 4 days of constant inspection, carried out under the eyes of the whole household. In ordinary daylight, over and over again without anyone even trying. A limp that wasn't obvious on day 1 shows up clearly by day 2. A rough patch of skin that isn't quite right gets noticed the instant a child happens to be stroking the animal's back. You simply cannot hide a real defect in a creature that is living inside your front room for 96 consecutive hours. Which leads directly into the next requirement. Because this whole inspection process has an actual, stated standard behind it, not just a vague sense of quality. The animal, the text specifies, has to be without blemish, a male, a year old. The Hebrew word standing behind that English phrase is tamim, and it rewards slowing down on, because, without blemish in English quietly suggests something closer to a beauty contest. The prettiest, shiniest animal in the flock. Tamim means something different and, honestly, more demanding, whole. Complete. Sound all the way through, with nothing missing and nothing damaged anywhere in it. This is the exact same word used to describe Noah as blameless among the people of his generation, and it shows up repeatedly across the Old Testament describing personal integrity. A heart that isn't split, isn't divided, isn't quietly compromised in some hidden corner. The standard was never really about attractiveness. It was about wholeness. And wholeness, notice, is something you can only actually verify by watching, patiently, over time, under completely ordinary conditions. Not by glancing at an animal once across a crowded marketplace and deciding it looks fine. Centuries later, one prophet would confront Israel harshly for having quietly abandoned exactly this standard, describing worshippers casually bringing blind, lame, and visibly sick animals to the altar. And asking them, pointedly, whether their own regional governor would ever accept a gift that shabby from them. What you're willing to offer, the prophet is arguing, says something unmistakable about what you actually think of the one receiving it. The 14th finally arrives, and the entire assembled community kills their chosen animals together, at the same hour, twilight, though the underlying Hebrew phrase translates more literally as, between the evenings, a window scholars have debated for a very long time. One reading places it in the stretch right after sunset as darkness sets in. Another places it earlier. In the back half of the afternoon, once the sun has clearly begun its descent. By the 1st century, Standard Temple practice had settled firmly on the afternoon reading, a small detail worth simply holding onto for now, because it resurfaces again later in this same study, in a very specific way. Then comes the instruction about exactly how to cook it. Roast it over fire, whole. Do not eat it raw, and do not, under any circumstance, boil it in water. Head, legs, and inner parts all included, nothing selectively set aside or left out. Two distinct Hebrew verbs are doing separate, careful work in this instruction. One refers specifically to fire roasting, while the other is simply the general, all-purpose verb for cooking. A term broad enough to cover several methods. It's only once the chapter specifically adds, in water, to that general verb that it lands, precisely, on boiling. And boiling, specifically, is what gets forbidden here. Why would the method of cooking possibly matter to God? Because of exactly what boiling requires as a process. To boil an animal properly, you first have to cut it into pieces small enough to actually fit inside a cooking pot. Joints get separated deliberately. The whole carcass becomes a collection of portions. That was, genuinely, the completely ordinary, unremarkable way meat got prepared in that world, and it's worth noting boiling is treated as entirely normal elsewhere within Israel's own later sacrificial system. Roasting the animal whole, by contrast, keeps the entire body in one single, unbroken piece. And Exodus goes noticeably out of its way to spell this out explicitly: head, legs, and inner parts, deliberately named. Everything stays attached to everything else. The animal that finally goes onto the fire on the evening of the 14th is, physically, the exact same complete, undivided creature that walked in through the family's door back on the 10th. Later Jewish tradition took this requirement seriously enough to work out precise rules about the roasting spit itself, specifying it had to be a particular kind of wood, pomegranate wood specifically, and never metal. The reasoning behind that rule is worth appreciating on its own. A metal spit conducts heat directly into whatever meat is touching it, which means that portion of the animal would technically be cooked by the metal rather than purely by the fire itself, quietly nudging the whole process back toward the very thing being forbidden. Other types of wood were rejected too, on the grounds that their bark or sap released moisture when heated, which risked edging the cooking process towards something closer to steaming or boiling. The requirement, tracked all the way down to the choice of stick, was fire, and only fire, touching the whole, undivided body. There's one more small line about preserving the animal's wholeness that's genuinely easy to skip past: it has to be eaten inside a single house, and none of the meat is permitted to be carried outside that house. One animal, one household, one body, staying together, start to finish. A companion instruction gets overlooked even more often than that one: whatever is left over by morning does not get saved for later, it gets burned completely, before sunrise. Leftovers are, in almost any other context, exactly how a poor household stretches a single meal across 2 days of eating. This meal specifically does not get to be stretched that way. Nothing about this animal is allowed to carry forward past the single night it belongs to. By the time the sun comes up, the animal is either fully eaten, or fully burned. Either way, by daylight, it's simply gone. Quick word before we keep going, because the chapter isn't finished protecting this animal's body yet. If a slow, patient, chapter-by-chapter study like this is doing something for you, subscribing genuinely helps a channel like this reach other people who are studying this exact same passage. Honestly, that's the only real way a channel like this grows. Alright, back into Exodus 12. The instruction not to break any of the animal's bones sits right alongside the roasting rule, and it's stated completely flatly, with no explanation attached to it at all. And, notably, it gets repeated word for word a full year later, when God provides a make-up Passover for anyone who missed the original date due to ritual impurity or travel. Understand exactly what's actually being requested here. Bones get broken constantly, as a completely normal part of ordinary butchering. Marrow, inside those bones, is genuinely valuable, nourishing food, and in a household that owns almost nothing, cracking a bone open for the marrow inside it isn't wastefulness at all. It's plain common sense. Israel is being told, deliberately and specifically, to leave that entirely reasonable option on the table, untouched. The body of this animal stays completely intact, from the exact moment it's first chosen on the 10th, all the way through to the moment whatever remains of it is finally burned at dawn on the 15th. A psalm, later, picks up this exact same image on purpose, describing a suffering person who is ultimately rescued by God, whose bones the Lord personally keeps whole. Not one of them broken. In Hebrew thought, bones consistently stand in for the underlying frame of a person, the structural integrity of an entire life. To have your bones kept whole was to come through something difficult with your integrity fully intact. Hold on to that connection for a moment. It comes back later in this study, and when it does, it isn't subtle. And now, the single most well-known instruction in the whole chapter, the one where a single Hebrew word quietly reshapes the entire picture. Take some of the blood, the text instructs, and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the beam stretching across the top of the door. On the very houses where the meal is going to be eaten. The applicator specified for this task is a small, bushy plant called hyssop, a plant that keeps reappearing again and again throughout Israel's later purification rituals, used by a priest to sprinkle a cleansed leper, and invoked directly by David, generations later, when he asks God to purge him with hyssop and make him clean. The blood itself sits, according to the text, in a Hebrew word that can mean either a bowl or basin, or, just as plausibly, a threshold, the sill running along the bottom of a doorway. Ancient translators genuinely disagree on which meaning is intended here. But either way, notice carefully where the blood actually ends up once it's applied, the 2 sides of the doorframe, and the beam across the top. The 3 parts of that doorway nobody would ever actually step on. The chapter itself never states an explicit reason for that specific placement, and it's worth being careful here not to invent a reason the text simply doesn't give us. But the pattern lines up consistently with how the rest of Scripture treats blood in general, as something set apart, never handled casually, never something meant to end up underfoot. Then comes verse 13, telling us plainly what this mark is actually for, in words that might genuinely surprise you. The blood, God says, will function as a sign for the people inside the house, placed on the outside of a door they cannot even see from where they're sitting at their own table. And yet God calls it their sign, their assurance. And then he adds that he himself will be the one watching for it. The underlying Hebrew verb behind Passover carries a range of meaning that includes simply passing by, but also something closer to a protective skipping or hovering motion. And some readers connect it to a later image, elsewhere in Scripture, of God shielding a city the way a bird hovers protectively over its own nest. Whatever the precise nuance turns out to be, what the text states in plain language is already enough to work with: the blood was seen. The house was spared. And nothing whatsoever about the house's architecture, its size, or its location provided that protection. Every single Israelite home that survived that night survived specifically because someone inside it had gone outside. In the dark, and physically, deliberately applied a mark exactly where they were told to apply it. One instruction remains, and it's the one that quietly turns an ordinary evening meal into a departure that's already, technically, in progress. Eat it, the text instructs, with your cloak gathered up and tucked into your belt, your sandals already on your feet, and your walking staff already in your hand. And eat it in haste. Take a second and actually picture that literally, instead of letting your eyes slide past it the way most readings do. A family, sitting down to dinner, indoors, at night, fully dressed for travel. shoes already on their feet. A walking stick gripped in the one hand not currently holding food. Nobody eats an ordinary meal dressed like that. You eat a meal dressed like that only when you already fully believe the wagon is sitting outside, waiting, and the driver has no intention of waiting much longer. The Hebrew word behind haste here carries a real edge of urgency, almost alarm, the specific hurry of people leaving under genuine pressure, not the mild hurry of people running slightly late. That same word gets used again later, looking directly back on this exact night, and it resurfaces once more, centuries afterward. In a very different prophetic promise about a future homecoming that, this time, explicitly won't require any scrambling at all. So here is the entire sequence, laid end to end, all 14 days compressed into one line, chosen on the 10th. Watched closely for 4 full days. Found completely whole, with nothing wrong discovered anywhere in it. Killed on the 14th, at twilight. Roasted entire, never divided into pieces. Bones left completely, deliberately unbroken. Blood carried outside and placed carefully above and beside a door. Eaten by a household already fully dressed to leave. Israel kept this exact pattern faithfully for centuries afterward. The specific location eventually shifted, moving, over generations, from individual household doorways to the temple courts in Jerusalem by the 1st century. But every family making that pilgrimage still knew every single one of these original requirements by heart, passed down largely unchanged. Now, carefully, lay the final week of Jesus' life directly over the top of everything just described, and read what follows slowly, because the honest, careful version of this connection turns out to be considerably stronger than an overstated one would ever be. Start well before that final week even begins, at the very opening pages of John's Gospel. John the Baptist is standing at the edge of the Jordan River when he sees Jesus approaching him, and the specific title that comes out of his mouth in that moment is this: The Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. The underlying Greek word he chooses is a completely ordinary term for a young sheep, and it happens to be the exact same word the Greek translation of the Old Testament uses in Isaiah's famous passage describing a figure led silently to slaughter, offering no resistance, opening no mouth in protest. That single announcement, made this early, sits right at the very front of John's entire Gospel, almost like a heading placed deliberately over everything that's still to come. Then comes the question of timing, and here honesty matters more than drama. John's Gospel counts backward from the feast itself. Jesus arrives in a town near Jerusalem 6 days before the Passover, and on the very next day, crowds meet him at the city gates, waving palm branches as he enters. To be completely straightforward about what the sources actually give us here, no Gospel writer prints an explicit calendar date for that entrance. Nobody writes, in so many words, the 10th day of the month. Careful, serious readers have argued over the precise reconstruction of that entire week for a very long time. And reasonable disagreement remains. What the accounts consistently do give us, though, is a count of days measured backward from the feast, and that count places Jesus' public entrance into the city squarely inside the same general window when households all across the region were actively selecting their own Passover animals for the year. What happens next during that same week, by contrast, is not disputed by anyone. Jesus goes directly to the temple, the single most public space in the entire nation. And across the days that follow, he is examined there, repeatedly, in broad daylight, in front of large crowds. Religious leaders approach him first with a pointed question about his authority to teach at all. A separate group brings a deliberately loaded political question about paying imperial taxes. Another group arrives with a constructed legal riddle designed to make any answer look foolish. A religious scholar asks him, seemingly in good faith, to name the single greatest commandment in the entire law. One delegation after another, arriving in daylight, in full public view, each one testing for some kind of flaw they can use against him. Nobody finds one. According to the record, after a certain point, no one dared to question him any further at all. From there, the examination shifts into an actual courtroom, and the verdicts begin stacking up one after another. The man who betrayed him throws the payment back and openly calls it innocent blood. A Roman governor's own wife sends an urgent warning to her husband to have nothing whatsoever to do with that righteous man. A regional ruler questions him at length and sends him back having found no formal charge worth pursuing. And the governor himself, according to the record, states publicly, not once, but 3 separate times, that he finds no guilt in the man standing in front of him. A Roman official, holding every conceivable political incentive to find some fault, formally and repeatedly signs off instead on the man's complete innocence. John's Gospel specifically notes that this was the day of preparation before the Passover, the standard term used for the day everything got ready ahead of a major feast or an approaching Sabbath. That same afternoon, inside the temple courts, that year's Passover animals were being slaughtered in large numbers, in a window one first-century Jewish historian places roughly in the middle of the afternoon. That is the same general window in which, according to the account, Jesus dies. Crucifixion, as a method of execution, killed slowly, through sheer exhaustion. Staying upright on the cross required continually pushing against your own legs simply to keep breathing at all. Roman soldiers, as a result, had a standard, brutally efficient method for ending things quickly whenever a body needed to come down before an approaching holy day. They broke the legs. It was routine procedure, and it worked reliably. John records that soldiers broke the legs of the 2 men crucified on either side of Jesus that day. But when the soldiers came to Jesus himself, they found he was already dead, and so, instead, they left his legs completely unbroken. One soldier pierced his side with a spear instead, purely to confirm what they already believed to be true. John notes that blood and water came out. He offers no explanation for that detail at all. He simply reports it, plainly, and moves on. Then John does something genuinely unusual for a narrator in the middle of telling a story. He pauses the entire narrative to personally vouch for what he has just described, insisting directly to the reader that he himself was there, close enough to actually see it happen, and that everything he's reporting is true. And then, in the very next line, he tells you exactly why he bothered mentioning a detail as small as which soldiers broke which legs. Because, he says explicitly, this happened specifically so that an old scripture would be fulfilled, not one of his bones would be broken. That line traces directly back through the psalm describing a rescued sufferer's unbroken bones, and further back still, all the way to the original instruction given in Exodus 12 concerning the lamb. And this connection is drawn out loud, in the text itself, by the person who was actually standing there. This isn't a hidden pattern quietly decoded centuries later by careful readers with too much time on their hands. There's no numerology involved anywhere in it. No secret arithmetic. The person telling this story stood at the foot of that cross, watched a soldier walk up to the 3rd body expecting to break its legs, watched him stop and walk away without swinging at all. And reached, immediately, on the spot, for a rule about a lamb in Egypt 15 centuries earlier. One additional small detail sits inside that same scene, easy to miss if you're moving quickly. Just before Jesus dies, someone lifts a sponge soaked in sour wine up toward his mouth, and John specifically notes that it was raised on a branch of hyssop. The exact same plant Israel once used to carry blood to a doorframe in Egypt. So, after walking through all of that, what do you actually do with a chapter this old, this specific, and this demanding? Start with the part Israel itself contributed. Because it turns out to be both considerably smaller than most people assume, and considerably more demanding than it first appears. The animal's death, on its own, saved absolutely no one. Picture the alternative scenario clearly: an animal killed in a courtyard, its blood collected and sitting quietly in a basin beside the door, while a family inside eats their dinner with the doorframe itself left completely bare. Nothing anywhere in the text suggests that particular house would have been spared regardless. The blood had to actually, physically reach the door itself. Someone in that household had to personally pick up the hyssop branch, walk out into a dark, frightened street on the single most terrifying night their entire nation had ever experienced, and deliberately mark the doorframe exactly where God had specified. That act was never a payment of any kind. Nothing about smearing blood on a piece of wood purchases anything at all from anyone. It was trust, made physically visible. It is, in fact, the one and only thing Israel genuinely contributed to their own rescue that night. Taking God completely at His word, and putting the required sign exactly where He had told them to put it, no more and no less. Then comes the harder half of that same instruction: go back inside the house afterward, and stay there until morning. Which meant spending the entirety of that night listening to whatever was happening in the streets outside, without ever once being able to step back out and personally verify that the mark was actually holding. Actually working. That, honestly, is probably where this chapter lands hardest for most people reading it today, thousands of years later. There are seasons in a life where the only thing genuinely within your control has already been done completely. And the only assignment left to you is simply to stay inside and wait through the dark without any way whatsoever to verify anything is actually working the way you were promised it would. The work of trust, in hours like that, is almost never dramatic. Most of the time, it's just staying put. There's one final piece left, and it explains the 4-day gap as well as anything the chapter offers us directly. Later in this same chapter, God instructs Israel to keep this specific night as a permanent, yearly observance for every generation to come, and He tells them exactly how the teaching of it will actually happen in practice. When a child, someday, eventually asks what this strange ceremony is supposed to mean, an adult in that household has to actually answer. The entire ritual is deliberately built to provoke a genuine question from a child noticing something unmistakably strange about the meal in front of them. So notice how the whole design runs in both directions at once, for days beforehand, so the adults in the household are forced to genuinely feel what this actually costs. Then, every single year afterward, a meal strange enough that a watching child will eventually ask about it, and someone will have to sit down and explain. And the original 4 days fit that exact same shape, running the opposite direction in time. God did not hand Israel a rescue that conveniently skipped past the real weight of it. He gave an ordinary family time, beforehand, to actually hold the animal, to feed it by hand, to grow genuinely used to having it around. To understand, concretely and personally, precisely what was being given up on their behalf before it happened. That is mercy operating on a deliberately slow clock, the exact same kind of mercy that allows a person to sit with something difficult for a while, unresolved, before they're finally able to fully understand what it actually means. Come back to the gap one final time. The 10th to the 14th. The chapter itself never once explains why, and it's genuinely better to leave that specific question honestly open than to invent a confident answer the text simply doesn't give us. But everything surrounding that gap points steadily in the same direction, a whole, completely undivided body. Bones left entirely unbroken. Blood you would never casually walk on. A death watched coming, patiently, for 4 full days, inside the very room you were living and eating and sleeping in. None of it was designed to make the rescue efficient. All of it, every single piece, was designed instead to make the rescue impossible to forget. And to make the substitute standing in for you feel unmistakably, permanently personal. The family that finally walked out of Egypt at dawn had eaten standing upright, dressed for travel, inside a house marked with blood. With a fire behind them that had burned steadily through the entire night. And 4 mornings earlier, one of them had carried a living, breathing animal through that very same door. So when a man stood at the edge of a river 15 centuries later, watching someone he was related to by blood walking steadily toward him, he didn't reach for the word teacher. He didn't reach for king, or prophet, or any of the titles that might have seemed obvious. He reached for the one single word that everyone standing there listening had grown up knowing exactly what it meant. An animal chosen on the 10th day, and kept, watched, until the 14th. The lamb. Everyone standing at that river already knew, without needing to be told, exactly what happened next to a lamb like that. Thanks for walking through this chapter with me. I'll see you in the next one.